My bank called me on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:14, not the automated fraud line, not a text alert about suspicious activity. Patricia Nolan herself, the branch manager I'd worked with for 9 years, calling from her direct extension, which I recognized because I'd dialed it 100 times over the years to schedule things, and because in all that time, she had never once called me without me calling first. I was in my garage in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sanding down an old dresser that used to belong to my wife's mother. I picked up on the first ring. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, it's Patricia. I need you to come down to the branch this afternoon. Can you get here by 4?" I said, "What's this about?" She said, "I'd rather show you in person." There was something in her voice I noted right away. Not panic. Patricia Nolan did not panic. She was a careful, exacting woman who had run that branch for over a decade, and who did not call a longtime customer downtown unless something had gone sideways in a way she needed to look at his face while she explained it. I said I'd be there. I finished sanding the dresser leg I was working on, wiped down my hands, and drove the 11 minutes into town. Patricia met me at the door herself instead of having the teller wave me back, which was the second thing that told me this wasn't routine. She walked me past her own office to a small conference room in the back, the one they used for loan closings, and she closed the door behind us. She sat down across from me and slid a manila folder across the table. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, 3 weeks ago, a loan application came through this branch requesting a $240,000 home equity line against your property on Sycamore Court. It was approved and funded 11 days ago." I opened the folder. The signature on the application was mine. Not close to mine. Mine. The loops in the W. The way I crossed the 2 T's in Whitfield. Exactly the way I've signed my name since 1974. I looked at the disbursement page. $240,000 had already moved out of an account with my name on it into an LLC I had never heard of, called Heritage Framework Holdings. I said, "Patricia, I never applied for a loan." She said, "I know that, Walter. That's why I called you instead of processing the next step, which would have been releasing the second disbursement tomorrow morning." I said, "There's a second disbursement?" She said, "There was." I froze it the moment I recognized what I was looking at. I turned the pages slowly. There was a copy of my driver's license, except the photograph was a stranger, a man in his 50s with sandy hair and a jaw I didn't recognize. Everything else on the license correct. My name, my address, my date of birth. There was a notarized power of attorney document dated 4 months earlier, authorizing a Daniel R. Pierce to act on my behalf in all financial matters. My signature at the bottom, the same impossible, exact signature. I looked up. Patricia was watching me with the expression of someone who had delivered bad news before and understood that the right thing to do afterward was wait. I said, "I don't know a Daniel Pierce." She said, "You might know him by a different name. That's the son of a notary named Lewis Pierce, who runs a mobile notary service out of Broken Arrow. He's also," and she paused here in a way that told me she'd rehearsed how to say the next part, "he's also your daughter's husband." My daughter's husband was named Louis. Louis Pierce's son was Daniel. I said the name Daniel out loud once, testing it. The way you test a word to see if it still means what it meant an hour ago. Patricia said, "Mr. Whitfield, I've already contacted our fraud division, and the loan is flagged. I called you before I called anyone else because you needed to hear it from me directly, and because whoever forged your signature used a level of detail that makes me think this wasn't opportunistic. This was planned." She reached for the phone on the conference room wall. She dialed an extension and said into it, "Denise, I need every document tied to the Whitfield home equity line pulled and printed, and I need it before this man leaves the building." She hung up and looked at me. She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Everything you already started, and one more thing." She said, "Name it." I said, "Don't let this get quiet." She said, "Walter, I've run this branch for 11 years and I have never once let a fraud go quiet. I'm not starting today." I picked up the folder. I thanked her, and I walked out through the lobby into the Tulsa afternoon, and I stood on the sidewalk outside the bank for a moment in the June heat and looked down at the folder in my hand. Daniel Pierce had forged a power of attorney, forged a loan application, funneled $240,000 of my equity into a shell company, and had done all of it while sitting at my kitchen table every other Sunday eating pot roast and asking whether my hip was still bothering me from the fall last winter. I did not feel rage standing on that sidewalk. I want to say that plainly because it matters to what comes next. What I felt was something with more structure to it than rage. I spent 31 years as a claims adjuster and a risk analyst for a mid-sized insurance carrier before I retired, and what I felt on that sidewalk was the particular, cold clarity of a man whose entire career had trained him to look at a loss event and ask exactly one question. How did this happen? And what does it cost to make it stop happening? I felt the shape of the exposure become visible to me in full, the way a fracture becomes visible once you know where to look for it. I knew what I was dealing with. The only open question left was what I intended to build in response. My name is Walter Whitfield. I am 67 years old. I live on Sycamore Court in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the man who forged my name onto $240,000 of debt had made a single catastrophic error in judgment. He had spent the better part of 2 years positioning himself around a widower he assumed was drifting into irrelevance. What he had actually positioned himself around was 3 decades of professional training in exactly this kind of failure, and a filing cabinet that a state auditor could work through blindfolded. He had 11 days before he found out how badly he'd miscalculated. Family, before I go further, let me back up and tell you how a pot roast dinner became a $240,000 fraud, because the how of it matters more than the what. I spent 31 years working claims and risk analysis for Heartland Mutual Insurance, headquartered in downtown Tulsa. People think insurance work is about paperwork, and it is. But underneath the paperwork, it's about pattern recognition. You learn to read a claim the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking for the hairline crack that tells you something happened that the surface story doesn't account for. After 31 years of that, precision stops being a work habit and becomes something closer to a nervous system. You document. You keep receipts. You note dates in the margins of things, not because you expect a catastrophe, but because you understand, in your bones, that the odds of needing that documentation over a long enough life are never actually zero. My wife Carol and I bought the house on Sycamore Court in 1994, a low brick ranch on a quarter-acre with a pecan tree in the back that Carol planted the year we moved in, and that now shades half the yard. Carol Ann Whitfield, born Carol Ann Merchant in Bartlesville in 1957, taught high school biology for 26 years and was, without exception, the most clear-eyed person I have ever known. She graded lab reports at the kitchen table with a green pen because she said red felt like punishment, and she could spot a logical hole in a teenager's reasoning from across the room without raising her voice. She was also the warmest person you'd ever sit across from, and I never stopped being surprised that both of those things could live in one person at the same time. She kept a small spiral notebook in her purse, where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. Grocery items next to bird sightings, next to something one of us had said at dinner that made her laugh. I found that notebook in her nightstand after she passed. I have read it more times than I'll admit to anyone. Carol was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2020 and died in January of 2022, at home, in the back bedroom, with both of our children present. I won't dwell on that morning. What I'll tell you is that the house on Sycamore Court has been a different house since she left it. And I have spent the years since learning to manage that difference, the same way I managed every structural loss in 31 years of adjusting claims, by accounting for it honestly and reinforcing where reinforcement is actually needed. We had 2 children. Our son Gregory is 42, an electrical engineer in Dallas, calls every Sunday without being reminded, drove up to Tulsa 4 times in the 18 months after Carol died without anybody asking him to, and inherited his mother's clear-eyed instincts almost exactly. Our daughter Rebecca is 39. She lives 20 minutes from me in Broken Arrow with her husband Louis Pierce and their son, my grandson, who is 7. Rebecca has her mother's intelligence, and she chose, sometime in her 30s, to point it in a direction her mother would have had real questions about. She is not a bad person. I want to be careful saying that, because it's true and because it matters to how this story ends. She is a person who married a man whose influence has, gradually and almost invisibly, recalibrated her over the years in ways I watched happen and didn't move fast enough to interrupt. Louis Pierce is 45. He runs a mobile notary and loan signing service out of Broken Arrow, the kind of business that puts him inside people's kitchens at their most vulnerable financial moments. Closings, refinances, estate documents, again and again. He has an easy laugh, a firm handshake, and the specific well-worn charm of a man who practiced being likable for so long it no longer costs him anything. He remembered my grandson's Little League schedule better than I did. He asked about my hip every single time he saw me. I understood inside the first year of Rebecca dating him that Louis was a man who ran the numbers on every relationship he was in, not necessarily on purpose, just structurally. The way some people can't help doing math in their head at a restaurant table. Carol knew it faster than I did. She said to me, driving home from the first Thanksgiving we had Louis over, in 2016, "Walter, that man never stops calculating." I told her I knew what she meant. She said she knew I did. The early years were unremarkable. Louis and Rebecca married in 2017. My grandson was born in 2018. They came to Sycamore Court for every holiday, and Louis was reliably warm, reliably attentive, always asking the right question at the right moment in a way that, at the time, felt like good manners and only later felt like reconnaissance. What I noticed and logged without acting on started around 2021, not long after Carol's diagnosis. Questions about whether I'd updated my will. Comments about how much the Sycamore Court lot alone must be worth now that the neighborhood had gentrified. An offer, phrased as a favor, to have his notary business clean up some of my estate paperwork so I wouldn't have to pay a lawyer for it. It was the pattern of a man who had decided that proximity to something valuable functioned as a kind of down payment on it. Carol noticed too, before she got too sick to notice much of anything. She said to me one night that winter, sitting up in bed with her notebook in her lap, "Make sure everything is somewhere you know, and make sure somebody besides you knows where it is too." I didn't fully understand the urgency in her voice at the time. I understood it later. After Carol died, Louis's approach shifted the way a strategy shifts once one of its obstacles is removed. The estate conversations got more frequent. The offers to help streamline things got more specific. In the fall of 2023, he asked, gently, over coffee, whether I'd thought about setting up a power of attorney, given my age and the fact that I was on my own now in that big house. I was walking 3 miles most mornings along the river trail by then. My doctor had called my last physical, the physical of a man 15 years younger. I understood, in that moment at the kitchen table, that Louis's concern wasn't really about my well-being. What I hadn't yet understood was exactly how far he'd already decided to take it. I found out how far when my bank called me on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:14. I drove from the branch on Patricia's advice straight to the office of Marian Delgado, an elder fraud and financial abuse attorney whose practice occupied the second floor above a hardware store on Cherry Street. Patricia had called ahead. Marian's assistant was holding the door for me before I even got out of the truck. I'd never met Marian before that afternoon, but Patricia had told her enough on the phone that she skipped the small talk entirely. She was maybe 55, silver hair pulled back tight, reading glasses pushed up into it, and she had the specific economy of movement of a person who has stopped wasting time on anything that isn't the case in front of her. She said, "Sit down, Mr. Whitfield. Tell me what's in the folder." I sat down. I put the folder on her desk. I said, "My daughter's husband forged my signature on a home equity loan for $240,000 against my house. He also forged a power of attorney authorizing himself to act on my behalf, using a different name. My bank flagged it before the second disbursement went out." Marian looked at the folder without opening it yet. She said, "How do you know it's forged and not something you signed and don't remember signing?" I said, "Because I have every check register, every bank statement, and every calendar entry going back 6 years. And there is nothing in any of them that corresponds to this loan, this notary appointment, or a meeting with anyone named Daniel Pierce. And because I know my own signature, and that man does not." She said, "What did you do for a living, Mr. Whitfield?" I said, 31 years in insurance claims and risk analysis." She said, "That explains the calendar entries." She opened the folder. She read for a long time without saying anything, turning each page with the slow, deliberate pace of a person who reads fraudulent paperwork professionally and has learned not to react to it on the first pass. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at me. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, if these documents are what they appear to be, this is elder financial exploitation under Oklahoma law, and it's also forgery, identity theft, and fraud against a lending institution. Those are 4 separate felony exposures for whoever did this." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you want to proceed?" I said, "I want that loan unwound and the money traced and recovered. I want the fraud on record somewhere that follows Daniel Pierce and Louis Pierce professionally for the rest of their careers. And I want to be in the room when either of them understands what they actually stepped into." Marian was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Those are 3 achievable goals." She picked up a legal pad. She said, "Start at the beginning. Don't skip anything you think doesn't matter. Let me be the judge of that." I talked for almost an hour. She wrote the entire time and interrupted only twice. When I finished, she asked me three things. Did Louis or Daniel have legal access to any of my accounts? No. My son Gregory was the only person with any documented authority, added after Carol died. Did Rebecca know what her husband had done? I said I honestly didn't know, and that I wanted to find out before I assumed anything either way. Did I have any record of the conversations where Louis raised the idea of power of attorney? I said, I have dated notes on every one of those conversations. I've kept notes like that for 30 years. It's not a habit anymore, it's just how I process things. Marion set her pen down. She said, Mr. Whitfield, I've handled around 40 of these cases in this county. Maybe 5 clients in that whole time walked in here with what you just handed me. I said, 31 years of claims work doesn't leave you when you retire. She almost smiled. She said, let me tell you what happens next. The first call Marion made from her office was to file an emergency motion with the county clerk to freeze any further disbursement and to place a formal hold flag on the Sycamore Court property title. The second call was to a private investigator named Ray Talbot, who worked out of a strip mall office off 71st Street, a heavy-set man in his early 60s who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and who cared, as he put it to me later, about what actually happened, not what anybody wants to have happened. He called Marion back 4 days later with what he'd found. What Ray found was not a man who'd stumbled into an opportunity. What Ray found was a plan built with the same patience a good notary uses when he's closing on a house, which made a certain terrible sense given what Louis did for a living. Over roughly 18 months, Daniel, using Louis's mobile notary credentials and a laptop, had built a driver's license template close enough to pass a teller's glance, opened a fraudulent LLC called Heritage Framework Holdings through an online formation service, and constructed a paper trail of 4 separate in-home notary visits to my house that had never occurred. He had lifted my actual signature, the real one, from a document I'd signed and mailed to the county assessor's office 2 years earlier disputing my property valuation, a document that had passed through Rebecca and Louis's hands when Rebecca helped me organize some old paperwork the year after Carol died. He had used a piece of my grief-era paperwork to steal my own signature back from me. I sat with that fact for a long moment when Marion told me, the same way I imagine you're sitting with it now. Ray also found that Daniel had opened a business checking account for Heritage Framework Holdings at a different bank across town, registered 8 months earlier. No clients, no invoices, no incoming deposits of any kind before the loan money landed in it, a clean, empty container built and waiting for exactly the amount that eventually arrived. Marion looked at that account history for a long moment. She said, he built the receiving end before he built the fraud. He expected this to work. I said, he's had a Sunday dinner seat at my table for 7 years, she said. He saw what he expected to see. A widower in his 60s, alone in a big house, easy to move around. I said, my wife told me he never stopped calculating. Marion said, she was right. He just wasn't running the numbers on the right variables. Then there was the matter of Rebecca, and I have to tell that part separately because it's the piece of this that cost me the most, and the piece I've turned over the most times since. I called her on a Thursday evening, 9 days before the court date Marion had gotten scheduled to unwind the loan and address the forged power of attorney. Marion had told me the conversation needed to happen before I walked into that hearing, that I needed to know where my own daughter stood. Rebecca picked up on the second ring, her regular voice, tired from her son's bedtime routine. I told her to just listen for a minute before she said anything. Then I told her everything. The folder, the forged loan, the forged power of attorney, the fake driver's license, the empty LLC waiting with its account number ready. All of it, straight through, no pausing. When I finished, there was a long quiet on the line, long enough that I said her name once, to make sure the call hadn't dropped. She said, Dad, I didn't know about any loan. I didn't know he'd done that. I said, what did you know? She said, Louis told me Daniel had set up some kind of financial protection plan for you, in case something happened with your health, and that you might push back on it at first because you're stubborn about asking for help. He showed me a 1-page summary, not the actual documents. He said the paperwork was just standard legal boilerplate. I sat with that. Standard legal boilerplate. The exact language a man uses when he needs his wife agreeable without ever making her informed enough to ask a real question. I said, Rebecca, are you going to stand behind what your husband did, or are you going to tell the truth about what you knew and when? A long silence. The sound of a person finally looking directly at something she'd been managing not to look at for a year. She said, "I'll tell the truth. All of it. Whatever it costs." I said, "Then meet with Marion tomorrow morning. Bring every text, every email, everything in writing." She said, "I have texts, Dad. Go, 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 go. A lot of them." I said, "I know you do, Rebecca. And I love you. That's not up for negotiation because of any of this. But what Daniel did is a crime, and what Louis knew and didn't tell you matters too. How you handle the next 9 days says a great deal about what happens after." She said, quietly, "I know." Near the end, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't push harder for the real paperwork." I said, "Push harder starting now." I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, thinking about something Carol had said about Rebecca once, in that careful way she had of saying the hard things. "She's got your stubbornness and his blind spots, Walter. She'll find her way out of it. Just give her the room to do it." I had given her the room. She had used it. Marion met with Rebecca the next morning and called me that afternoon. 40-some text messages over nearly a year, Rebecca had understood there was some kind of legal arrangement in motion. She had not known it was built on forged documents and a fake identity. She had been managed by her own husband, deliberately kept just informed enough to comply and not informed enough to ask the wrong question. That was the accurate read of it, and the legally meaningful one. Marion also told me she'd filed a formal report with the Tulsa County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, on top of the bank's own fraud referral. She said, "Are you ready for Thursday?" I said, "I've been ready for Thursday since I was standing on the sidewalk outside that bank with the folder in my hand." She said, "Then get some sleep before it." Gregory drove up from Dallas the night before without waiting to be asked. He called at 5 and said he was already on the road. He got in around 10, and we sat at the kitchen table and I told him the whole thing start to finish. He listened the way his mother used to listen, all the way through, no interrupting. When I finished, he looked at the table for a second and said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I said, "I'm functional." He said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "No, it isn't. Okay comes after Thursday." He said, "Mom always said you were better at taking care of everybody else than yourself." I said, "She was right about most things." We talked past midnight. I lay in bed afterward looking at the ceiling, not scared, just wide awake in that particular way you get the night before something that matters, aware rather than anxious. I thought about Carol's green pen and about 31 years of documentation habits and what it means to build a discipline that outlasts the reason you first needed it. Eventually, I slept. The Tulsa County Courthouse on Thursday morning was unremarkable in the specific way courthouses always are. Tan corridors, hard fluorescent light, decades of other people's urgent business worn into the floor tile. Marion met me in the hallway at 8:40. Gregory stood next to me. Patricia Nolan showed up at 8:50 because Marion had asked her to appear in person, and she'd said yes, without hesitating once. At 9:05, Louis and Daniel arrived together with an attorney, a heavyset man named Roy Castellan, who had the look of someone expecting a routine morning. Daniel was in a gray suit, hair combed, the full professional presentation of a man who still believed he was going to walk out of that room with something he'd spent 2 years building. He saw me in the hallway and his expression recalibrated fast, then smoothed back over. He said, "Mr. Whitfield, I wasn't expecting you'd come down here yourself." I said, "It's my house and my signature you forged, Daniel. Where else would I be?" He said, "I think there's been a real misunderstanding here." I said, "I know exactly what kind of misunderstanding it was." His attorney put a hand on his arm and steered him toward the courtroom doors. The judge was the Honorable Renata Souza, on the bench 11 years, known around the courthouse for having almost no patience for a hearing that wasted the morning. She reviewed the file, looked up, and said, "This is a matter concerning a disputed home equity lien and a power of attorney filed against the interests of Mr. Walter Whitfield. Counsel, identify yourselves." Roy Castellan identified himself as counsel for Daniel Pierce. Marion identified herself as counsel for Walter Whitfield. Judge Souza looked at Marion a moment and said, "Miss Delgado, I've reviewed your emergency filing. I want to confirm on the record that Mr. Whitfield is present and wished to appear personally today." I said, "I am, Your Honor, and I asked specifically to be here." The judge looked at me with an expression that was carefully unreadable but that I thought, underneath the neutrality, held something close to genuine attention. She said, "Very well. Mr. Castellan, you may proceed on behalf of your client." Roy Castellan stood, and laid out the basis for the loan and the power of attorney in the practiced language of somebody who'd made this kind of presentation many times before. He referenced the notarized documents. He referenced the driver's license on file. He said his client had acted at the request of the account holder and that the loan proceeds were being used to consolidate and protect Mr. Whitfield's assets on his behalf. He said the bank's own branch manager could confirm the loan had been properly processed. Judge Souza looked over at Patricia, seated in the gallery. She said, "Is the branch manager for First Prairie Bank present?" Patricia stood. She said, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge said, "Miss Nolan, was this loan properly authorized by Mr. Whitfield?" Patricia said, "It was not, Your Honor. Mr. Whitfield never applied for this loan and never appeared in our branch to sign any of the documents in that file. The identification on record does not match his actual government identification, which I have brought with me today. Along with the full internal fraud review, my branch initiated the moment the discrepancy was discovered. The courtroom did the thing courtrooms do when something real happens in them. Everyone in the room going a little more still all at once, not for show, just people quietly recalculating. Roy Castellan went very still at the table. Daniel sat beside him, and I watched his face in the exact second after Patricia finished speaking. 31 years of claims work teaches you to recognize the precise moment a forecast collides with reality and loses. The moment the model and the outcome stop matching. I had watched that moment across a claims table more times than I could count. And what I saw on Daniel's face in that courtroom was a man understanding, in real time, that everything he'd built over 2 years had just failed completely, not partially. Judge Souza said, "Mr. Castellan, I want to be direct with you. The bank has just testified, on the record, that this loan and the identification supporting it were never authorized by Mr. Whitfield. Do you have a response?" Roy Castellan said, and his voice had lost the confident register it started with. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of any issue with the underlying documentation." The judge looked at him, then at Daniel. She said, "Mr. Pierce, are you the individual who submitted this loan application and this power of attorney?" Daniel stood slowly. He said, "Your Honor, I can explain the context." She said, "I expect you'll need to, at length, and not to me. This proceeding is suspended, not concluded. I'm referring the forged identification, the forged power of attorney, and the fraudulent loan application to the Tulsa County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division for full review. I'm also entering a finding on the record that no valid authorization from Mr. Whitfield exists for either the power of attorney or the loan, and that the lien against the Sycamore Court property is to be released immediately." She looked at me. "Mr. Whitfield, I want it stated clearly for the record that nothing about this proceeding reflects on you, and that the court takes seriously what was attempted against you here." She looked once more at Daniel. "Mr. Pierce, I'd strongly advise you speak with your attorney about what comes next. This hearing is adjourned." She stood and left, and the room reorganized itself in the wake of it. Marion touched my arm and said quietly, "That's exactly how that needed to go." Gregory stood beside me and put his hand on my shoulder without saying anything, which was exactly the right amount to say. I looked across the room at the other table. Roy Castellan was leaning in, talking low and fast to Daniel. Daniel sat very still, the suit and the haircut and the composure all still technically in place and meaning nothing anymore. He wasn't the man who'd walked in that morning. That man had a plan and a structure built over 2 years. This man had none of it left. He glanced up once, not deliberately at me, just the involuntary way people look around when they're trying to rebuild a world that's just come apart. Our eyes met for a second. I didn't look away, and I didn't say anything. I just looked at him steady, the way a man looks at a number he calculated a week ago and finds sitting exactly where he expected it to be. Then I picked up my jacket and walked out of the Tulsa County Courthouse into the June morning, my son beside me, my attorney behind me, and the folder that started all of it tucked under Marion's arm as evidence in a case that was only just beginning. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation within a week of the hearing. Daniel was charged in August, 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and 1 count of loan fraud. He no longer holds any position requiring a financial or notarial license anywhere in the state. Louis's own notary bond was suspended pending a separate review into whether his credentials were used with his knowledge, a question the DA's office is still working through. Rebecca filed for divorce in September. She brought her phone records and her texts to Marion's office without being asked twice, and told the truth on every question anyone put to her. She's my daughter. The line between being deceived and choosing not to look too hard at something is one I've decided, for her, to draw generously. She and my grandson live 15 minutes from Sycamore Court now. She comes for dinner most Sundays. She asks a lot more questions than she used to. Gregory drove up from Dallas for the first of those dinners. The three of us sat at my kitchen table for the first time in longer than I could remember without the weight of the last 2 years sitting over everything like humidity. Rebecca said, "Dad, Mom knew about Lewis, didn't she?" I said, "Your mother knew things before most people finished thinking them." She said, "What did she know?" I said, "She knew he never stopped calculating. She just didn't know exactly what he was calculating toward." Rebecca looked at her plate a while. Then she said, "I should have asked her more when I had the chance." I said, "Ask now instead." She left enough behind to work with. Carol's green pen is still sitting in the mug on her nightstand. I haven't moved it. The pecan tree out back dropped a good crop this fall, more than it has in years, and I split it 3 ways between my house, Gregory's family, and Rebecca's. Sycamore Court is held in the Carol and Walter Whitfield Family Trust now. Gregory is the named beneficiary. Marion Delgado is the successor trustee. Everything that matters to me is somewhere I know exactly where it is, and it's written down. I'm 67 years old. I walk the river trail most mornings. I keep dated notes on every conversation that matters, and I run a filing system a state auditor could get through in under 20 minutes. I am, in every meaningful and practical sense, a fully capable man, managing his own life. The documents that claimed otherwise now sit in a court record as exhibit evidence in a criminal case. That's the only record of this that actually matters. My father used to say, "A man is measured by what he builds and what he's willing to protect." He drove a delivery route out of Bartlesville for 38 years, and he built a steady life and guarded it every single day until he couldn't anymore. I absorbed that from him the way you absorb the things nobody ever sits you down and explains. I built something here. Somebody tried to take it out from under me while sitting at my table asking about my hip. I held on to it with 31 years of paperwork habits, one very good attorney, and a bank manager who picked up the phone herself instead of letting it wait until morning. That's the inheritance that actually held up. If this one stuck with you, tell me in the comments which part hit you hardest, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you're new around here, stay a while. We tell one of these every week.